Welcome to Humanity in Deep Space, an initiative involving a planetary conversation surrounding the range of interconnected issues and hard challenges ranging from science to health to food, design, economics, governance, space and planetary ethics, etc., that must be addressed as our species continues the transition to deep space. This is episode 15, Human Reproduction in Space. The rapid acceleration of space exploration makes understanding the dynamics, safety, ethics, and liability involved with human reproduction in space an issue of utmost importance. Efforts to have self-sufficient outposts fundamentally rely on reproduction being possible. And the realization of space tourism has now made conception in space a much sooner than later issue. Today's guests are Dr. Egbert Edelbroek, founder and CEO of SpaceBorn United, Dr. Alexander Layendecker, director of the AstroSexological Research Institute, and Dr. Scott Solomon, biologist and space communicator from Rice University. You can find the full biographies of our presenters on our website at humanityindeepspace.com. Our moderator is Kris Kimel, founder of Humanity in Deep Space and co-founder of the commercial space company Space Tango.
Hello, this is Kris Kimel with Humanity in Deep Space. I would like to welcome you to another one of our webcasts. I think this one is one of the more interesting and perhaps complex topics that we've dealt with. We've got some great panelists as well. For those of you who may be the first time that we've been tuning into one of our webcasts, our structure is conversations. And so we don't have formal presentations, and it really is a conversation among the panelists. And then after we're going 10, 15, 20 minutes, you'll be able to ask questions through the curated chat on your computer, and I along with the panelists will see those, and we'll try to get to those as soon as we can. I want to start off by thanking our sponsors for Humanity in Deep Space, Space 629, Science and Kentucky Science Technology Corporation, National Stem Cell Foundation, the Serving Institute at NASA, headed by Greg Schmidt, Children's Center, Baird Financial, Space Tango, Media Collaboratory, the START program at the University of Kentucky, a STEM program, Higher Orbits Interstellar Foundation, Visit Lex, and 22 Solutions. And very much appreciate all of our sponsors who make these webcasts and other activities and programs that we do through Humanity in Space, Deep Space possible. So having said all of that, let me start by I'm going to ask each of the panelists to briefly introduce themselves. Let me start with Egbert.
Sure. It's a pleasure to be in your show, Kris, and with all the attendees from all over the world. So about myself, I'm the founder and CEO of SpaceBorn United. It's a biotech space research company that is focused on enabling and studying stages of human reproduction in space, and while doing so, also improving IVF on Earth, in vitro fertilization. As a scientist and also as an entrepreneur, I'm always focused on transformative, impactful innovation, and I'm basically passionate to help humanity to become a multiplanetary species, and in that way expand the human comfort zone beyond Earth. And I combined my passion for space exploration with reproductive technology shortly after I became a donor for an IVF clinic, a sperm donor, in 2010, which inspired me to re-engineer existing IVF technology to also make it work in space and study reproduction in space. Okay. And I earned my PhD in courage development in organizations.
Thanks. Alexander.
Hey, good afternoon, Kris. Thanks for having me. Alex Layendecker, everybody. I'm the founder and director of the AstroSexological Research Institute, which is a Florida-based, Cape Canaveral, Florida-based 501c3 nonprofit that is dedicated to the comprehensive study of human sexuality factors and reproductive factors as they apply to space. I have a operational professional background with the military. I started off in space launch, did about 5 years doing that, and then later went into space tactics, orbital operations at Nellis Air Force Base. followed by a stint with undergraduate pilot training, and now I fly for the 920th Rescue Wing, based at Patrick Space Force Station. Patrick Space Force Base. Canaveral Space Force Station is just to the north of me here. And we conduct operational support for the space launch program here as well, and future astronaut rescue, as the manned space flight program starts to come back.
Okay, thank you. Scott.
Hey, Kris, and hey to everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to come back and do another webinar with Humanity in Deep Space. These are always a lot of fun and super interesting. So a little bit about me. I am an associate teaching professor at Rice University. My training and background is in ecology and evolutionary biology. And a lot of my research has looked at how do new species come into existence through evolution? And now I'm mostly applying that question to trying to think about what would happen to our own species if we were successful at creating long-term settlements beyond Earth. So in addition to being a biologist, I'm also a science communicator. And I have done a number of science communication projects on this topic, including a three-part docu-series called Becoming Martian that looks at this very topic. And now I'm working on a book on this topic as well. So the book, which is under contract at MIT Press, is basically about how living in space would change the human body and mind. And as I'm sure we're going to talk about, a very big part of that question has to do with human reproduction beyond Earth.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Scott, John, what's the topic, the title of your first book?
Oh, yes. My first book is Future Humans, Inside the Continuing Evolution of Humans. So basically, my first ever exploration of this topic was a more general question about whether humans are still evolving. And the conclusion that I come to in that book is that, yes, indeed, we are still evolving. But that leads to questions, of course, of what's going to happen in the future. And so one scenario that I look at the very end of that book, very briefly, is the possibility that if we ever did leave Earth and create settlements on Mars or elsewhere, that could lead to the evolution of a new human species. So that's now the topic that I'm exploring in much more depth.
Thank you. So I thought it'd be interesting to maybe start with what the kind of the fundamental question of starting out, because a lot of issues we'll deal with today, of kind of where we are right now in understanding the whole issue of reproduction in space. Obviously, there's not a whole lot of information. Research has been done at this point, but kind of tying that into the evolution of humans and kind of where we are and where do we stand in terms of understanding that. I think I'll ask Scott to start us off.
Sure, yeah, happy to kick it off, but also would love to hear from the other two panelists here who know quite a bit about this. But yeah, I mean, this is something that I'm exploring in great detail at the moment for the book that I mentioned. I mean, to put it in very, very brief terms, look, we have learned quite a bit about how being in space affects the human body through studies in the last, 50 to 60 years of people that have gone mostly to low Earth orbit. A very small number of people who have gone beyond low Earth orbit to the moon. And there's a lot that we know about how space affects the human body. But so far, there's been very, very little research on any aspects that relate directly to reproductive biology. There have been some studies on animal models, including on fish, on organisms like sea urchins, and some rodent work as well. But without going into too much detail, I would say that the results of that research so far is largely inconclusive. And partly that's just because there really hasn't yet been enough of it. So we don't really have basic answers to important questions like, is conception in space possible? Is embryo development in space affected by microgravity or high radiation? Would a human birth be possible in those types of conditions? And then, lastly, I would lump under this question of human reproduction questions about child development. What happens if a child who is born, say, on Mars, grows up and their body develops under those conditions? How would that person's body be different from if they were growing and developing here on Earth? So I'd say largely we are still at a point where we just don't have a lot of answers to those important questions.
Okay. Alexander, what may ask you to chime in with your perspective on this initial thought?
Yeah, absolutely. So with my background, I actually did a PhD in this area back in 2016. And I've sort of always built myself as a researcher of the research. So trying to comprehensively see everything that has happened so far that needs to happen in the future. As Scott mentioned, the research has been very, very scant in this area. There's only been really a handful of, small mammal experiments that have actually flown in orbit. And most of the results, as he said, are inconclusive, but I would also add on to that they trend toward the negative. We tend to see a lot of physiological issues that have come out of those experiments, effectively establishing a baseline that reproduction in microgravity, as we currently see it, is an absolute no-go. So there were rat pup groups that were flown in the 90s by NASA, where we saw the postnatal care. For the younger the groups were, the higher the fatality rate was. So fatality rates among, I think it was a group of 5-day-old pups, were 90%. Among a group of 8-day-old pups, that had fallen to 10%, and then there were 14-day-old pups that actually all survived, but they all had significant anomalies. There were, I think, even for the pups that survived, all of them were at least 25% underweight. Hydrocephaly, so abnormal motor function, all sorts of issues that came out of postnatal growth while being flown in microgravity. And that could be a synergistic combination of the microgravity and the radiation of those environments. There was a recent study that was done by the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency that they just recently published on called Space Pup, which indicated that a already fertilized embryo that had been frozen and flown into space and then thawed developed normally as a blastocyst. I think they allowed the growth for a few days. So blastocyst formation can proceed in microgravity, but there are still, so many gaps in the data that we're going to need to conduct a lot more experiments to just to really fill in the blank space.
Okay.
So that is kind of where things sit right now, so far as what we do know.
Alex, the first study you mentioned, when was that done?
So the rat pup groups that were flown by NASA were flown in the 90s. I forget the exact shuttle missions that they were on.
Okay, but they don't shuttle missions. Okay.
But yeah, they were, I believe that was from roughly 1992 to 97. And if I'm recalling correctly, there was another rat mission that was, a rodent study mission that was actually on Space Shuttle Columbia when we lost Columbia back in the early 2000s.
Okay. So Egbert, your company, which is a commercial company, is developed in basically building itself around trying to add information and to this problem and this issue. So tell us a little bit about what your company is trying to do in this arena.
Yeah, my pleasure. So as Alex mentioned, space is not just one environment. And we are focusing on filling the many data gaps around partial gravity effects. The studies that have been done, experiments that have been performed, have all been focused on the effects of microgravity. While we are learning so much about it, but SpaceBorn United is long-term focus is also studying partial gravity effects. So, for example, will the Martian gravity environment be sufficient for healthy embryo development, for healthy conception? So what we do is basically three things. We study the conditions for safe the first safe stages of reproduction in space, starting with animal models, obviously. The second thing is we translate the outcomes of that research into validated missions, a space missions program that enables studying those different stages. And the third thing, what we do, that's basically the core of what we do now, is translating the outcomes into technology. So basically, re-engineering existing technology from the fertility sector, from the IVF sector. And we are making like a mini lab, like a small shoebox size mini lab that facilitates the conception and the first days of embryo development in different gravity settings. So we use microfluidic technology in a disk, and by changing the rotation speed of that disk, we can let the embryos inside experience different partial gravity levels, but also Earth-like gravity.
Okay, so obviously there's a lot of angles to this, but one of the obvious ones is that as we talk about sustainable outposts and perhaps some sort of settlements in the future, multi-generational, these are all kind of predicated on the idea that we will be able to, in fact, reproduce safely and ethically in space. So how do you see the fact that we don't have the answers yet? And we may, at some point we may know a lot more, but right now we don't have the answers. What are the, what are the implications of that? And do you see this as one of those foundational problems that really has to be solved first or pretty initially before we proceed much further because of the implications?
I would say yes, indeed, because it's pretty pointless to spend billions of dollars and all those talents on preparing settlements, for example, on Mars, because they want to make these settlements really independent from Earth. It's not suitable for space tourism. The implications are too big. The medical problems are too big. So you want these settlements to become independent, which implies you need to solve the reproductive challenge as well. And you don't want to study that on Mars or close to Mars. That's not necessary. That's crazy complex and expensive. So you can study reproduction in stages, without human reproduction, without human natural reproduction, by using assisted reproductive technologies. So ethically, that's much easier, obviously. You're only exposing embryos to the risks of space and radiation and not grown adults. And still, you have to be ethical for that. But that's the angle, to study this affordably and ethically in the right way without going to Mars or without exposing adults.
Other thoughts?
Well, I would tack on from the ethical side of things. Right now, we are not in a position to ethically, or it would not be medically ethical to attempt reproduction in space at this point. Knowing what we do know from the data indicators that we have at the moment, and the fact that we're not really on a path as of right now to solve those in a timely manner. There have been multiple reasons why research on reproduction in space has sort of been stymied within the space community. NASA, for its part, has other things that it sees as a higher priority that are on its plate. I mean, they're still focusing on just keeping humans healthy for an interplanetary journey to Mars, and engineering the vehicles that are going to get us there. So they are, a organization of by and for engineers, and their primary directive is engineering vehicles. So with regard to the rest of the space community, they sort of take their lead from NASA, and there are other factors, that will play into why NASA won't address this as much right now at this point in time. But what NASA, what NASA's power is that the rest of the space community sort of follows NASA's lead. So there has not been a lot of other agency work that has gone toward this. ESA, JAXA, they are a little bit more forward about it,
Mhm.
and the Russians as well. Roscosmos has actually Roscosmos conducted the first experiments on reproduction in space in 1979 using biosats, and they had a live rat experiment on Cosmos 1129 was the mission. But right now, what nobody could have anticipated probably in NASA is just how fast the commercial sector has progressed. We are within, I would say, 5 to 8 years of SpaceX. SpaceX is out front at the moment, but SpaceX being able to get humanity mass access to space, whereas we will enter into there's going to be a macro fiscal trend that develops, that is already developing as we speak, that is going to allow people that are upper middle class to afford a trip into space
Yeah.
within, I would say, by 2030. And honestly, that's probably being a little generous in terms of the timeline. It could be sooner than that. We could see somebody of my mass, I could get launched to space for the cost to the company of about $7,500, because we have gone from a point where it costs us $25,000 a kilogram to launch mass into space. Right now, that is sitting at $1,400 a kilogram, and as soon as Starship becomes fully operational, we can expect that to drop below 1,000. And within 2 to 3 years of Starship becoming fully operational, we can probably expect that to drop to a tenth. So under $100 a kilogram, which that puts us right in that sweet spot of people being able to fly to space. It's not it won't be a small expense, but millions of people that have never had access before will now be able to afford. That's something that you can afford a ticket for $10,000 for a once in a lifetime trip. People will spend $5,000 on a cruise, every other year. So it will be something that is financially attainable for millions of individuals that could not access it before. With those millions of individuals going into space, potentially, you now have the potential for copulation, possibilities of pregnancies happening. There's still a lot that we don't know, but we do know that attempting to get pregnant in space right now is probably dangerous for, not only the child, but also the mother. So a lot of unanswered questions that need to be solved right now because research takes time. And if we're hitting these milestones within 5 to 10 years, we are going to, kind of be left in a situation where everybody's standing around staring at each other and nobody has answers.
Right. Scott?
Yeah, I think, there's been some important points that have been made already. I wanted to pick up on something that Egbert mentioned earlier about those partial gravity effects. I think that's really one of the things that's most difficult for us to, speculate about right now because, almost all of our information about how space affects the body comes from, the weightless environment of low Earth orbit.
Right.
There's only been what is it, like 24 people that have ever been to the surface of the moon, and they spent no more than a few days there. If we think about the increase in our knowledge that came from the point in which, the Apollo era ended and people were spending, 10 days max in space, up until, recent times when we've had people spending upwards of a year in space. Different things happen to the body when you're in that environment for a prolonged period of time. And we've learned so much about our reaction to space from studying people in that prolonged, time on, for example, the International Space Station. I'm just excited for what all we're going to learn once we've got, for example, a lunar base, and you can have people spending a long period of time in the moon gravity, right? Partial gravity. We're going to learn a tremendous amount through biomedical research there. Much of that should focus on aspects that are relevant to reproductive biology. I'm not saying it should be the only thing, but we need to learn, no women have ever been to the moon. So we actually have no ability to ask questions about how partial gravity affects the female body.
Good point.
So there's just a lot that we're going to learn, and much of it will be relevant for these questions. So yes, an urgency when it comes to the need, because space tourism is happening more and more, but also I think we're on the cusp of being able to answer questions that so far we just haven't had a way to answer.
Yeah, in fact, we had a question come in from Colleen McLeod about the varying types of microgravity and how that might change from the moon to Mars, and even affecting things like spinal growth, which is obviously really good questions we don't understand yet. So let me ask you: there seems to me there's two or three really interesting points here. One that Egbert mentioned, which is obviously if we quote can't do it. If it turns out, whatever that means, and however we determine that, or we determine we don't know for sure, but we're not at a level of maturity yet in terms of our information and data to say, yeah, it's okay. There's no sense, at least there's no sense spending, billions and billions and billions of dollars talking about, having thousands and thousands of people living in space or on Mars. If that is the case, that's one aspect of it. The second aspect is given everything that you've said, another key question that pops into my mind is, how do we actually determine this? Because there are so many different parts of and layers to conception and pregnancy and birth, and then development of a child. As you said, there could be things could go right at one stage and go very bad at another stage. And the same thing would happen. I was talking to Scott today, it happened with the radiation effects after the atomic bomb, is that, everything looks good until, somebody's 5, 6, 7 years old, or even 10 years old, or even their offspring. And suddenly you find genetic mutations or things that render this really very, 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 very dangerous. And then the third thing, which I want to get to as a part of that, is there was an article that appeared in a physics publication not too long ago called Sex in Space. And it was really interesting because the author talked about the liability, the ethics and the liability of just the subject you guys have all brought up. And that is, we already have co-ed crews in space. And with a lot of private sector commercialization companies, that's going to continue, et cetera. And the whole aspect of when we not know, how do we protect against that not happening by accident, and what are the implications of that? So those are 3 different points. And again, we're ready if anybody wants to ask questions from the audience. We've got several in, but please feel free to go ahead and ask those now. So let me throw that back to all of you. Maybe start with the issue of how are we going to determine this, really?
I think part of it has to do with creating the conditions as close as possible to the conditions on Earth. So the technologies aren't ready yet in space to create the right gravity environment. Fortunately, some of the newer space stations in development will include large wheels to create artificial gravity, but I'm not sure if that's going to be Earth-like gravity, but hopefully close. And of course, you want to have the same level of radiation protection, and that could at least cover the 2 major topics, the radiation and gravity differences, and then take it very slow, step by step. But I can imagine Alex or Scott can go into the details of that a bit more.
Yeah, no, I'll take it. The way that we're going to establish what gravity levels are, so humanity already knows what levels of radiation are hazardous, to pregnant mothers, humans in general, even fully grown humans, sort of our limits of what we can take. The unknown right now is microgravity levels, and the question of, is the line, is 0.16 Earth G on the moon, is that going to be enough to, safely develop? Is 0.38 on Mars going to be enough? We can't right now know the answers to these things. So really, what is the gravity prescription, as it's been posed by other researchers in the past? I have always been an advocate for something that we've sort of coined as an orbital incubator, which is, as Egbert pointed out, we know that Earth works. Earth is the environment in which we have evolved, over hundreds of millions of years. the one constant that has always been the same has been gravity. We've always had, 1 Earth G of gravity, the acceleration rate. So if we are able to recreate that somehow in a space environment, and then slowly lever it down, lever the amount down to see what range we can reach that is still medically and ethically acceptable to us in terms of the long-term effects. That is going to be our green window, if you will. There was actually a presentation done by a former NASA chief of medicine, who's the chief of medical operations at Johnson Space Center, Dr. Jim Logan, who talked about potentially hollowing out something like an asteroid, or I think in his presentation he actually talked about Mars's moon of Deimos, which is a very small compared to our moon, but you could fit a very long line of engineered superstructures if you drilled drilled kind of a long tunnel through the core. That would allow us to create sort of those rotating superstructures that generate artificial gravity, and you would have the mass of the asteroid around you to provide all the radiation protection equivalent to or better than what you would get on Earth. So we could potentially craft a livable Earth-like environment in a habitat like that, and that is humanity's second basket. The old phrase, don't have all of your eggs in one basket. So that's our existential insurance policy, is to have something like that. And we have colonies on the surface of Mars, or subsurface, that we're able to travel down to once people reach full physical maturity. But humans are going to have to grow up in as close to an Earth environment as possible if we want to not really adversely impact our genetics.
Okay. For Scott chimes in, let me just add another dimension to this that I think obviously makes it even more difficult. There are many aspects to this. I mean, one of the problems I think is it's just not gravity. I mean, we've had very few humans go beyond the Van Allen belt, and like you said, the humans that have been to the Mars, we haven't had any females yet. I mean, to the moon, have been there for a couple of days, and of course, one of the absolutes here is that all life on Earth, human and pre-human before, have all evolved within a 1G environment. So our whole evolutionary process is predicated on that kind of environment. And so as we look at whether it's radiation, it seems to me that see what your reaction is. There are actually a lot of different issues here that we cannot, we in fact can't simulate microgravity on Earth to any great degree. So with that given, again, how would we deal with the multidimensional complexity of all that? Scott?
Yeah, well, gosh, we could have a whole webinar on just that. But yeah, I mean, I'll take a stab at it. I think, I mean, of course, you're right, and Alex was mentioning this point as well about how our entire evolutionary history, a lot of things have changed throughout our evolutionary history. The strength of gravity has not in any meaningful way. But I think there are some lessons that we can learn from our own evolutionary history and from what we know about the evolution of other species. And that is that, species are really good at adapting to new environments. Ours has been as well. One thing I do like to make sure we make a distinction about, though, is like the difference between an individual person going out and adjusting or acclimating to a new environment. Like, we've seen from all the, studies on people in low Earth orbit, after a period of time, the body adjusts. And in fact, a lot of the challenges that astronauts face when they come back to Earth come from the fact that their body did go through an adjustment period, reducing the volume of their plasma and things like that help them to do well in that space environment. It's only really a problem when they come back to Earth, right? So that's an adjustment that the body makes. But of course, once you're talking about multi-generational time, then you've got the possibility for adaptation through, natural selection. Right. But the thing about natural selection is that's not a pleasant process. I mean, natural selection works when some individuals survive and others don't. And obviously, we would like to avoid adapting to, living on Mars through natural selection. That's not the preferred way to do it. So I think everything that we can learn about how to best prepare people for being in that environment, how to set people up for success, will allow people to make those adjustments in their body. Perhaps, we're talking about things that could be done in advance to help, through, for example, genetic therapies that would prepare a person's body for living in the environment on Mars. That's much preferable to, letting natural selection take its course. It will take its course if we let it, but that's not necessarily the optimal outcome, right?
Yeah, we did a webcast a year or two ago with several representatives from Chris Mason, who was one of the twin study doctors, and also people from Harvard Medical School, including George Church and Team Wing. And so I wanted to, and we weren't talking so much about reproduction, but they had some really misgivings that deep space would be questionable without some sort of genetic engineering. I think there's something they just didn't know that was going to be possible. Which obviously throws in something else here. So we get back to this, I guess, to this fundamental issue. And I think the other thing that comes up, which we said, is that how at what point do we really I read a science fiction book a number of years ago, for example, and I can't remember who the author was, but in the book, it was about interplanetary travel, and not interstellar, but interplanetary, and the crews went out for years at a time. And they didn't necessarily get into why, but one of the points was that all astronauts that got selected, whether they were male or female, had to be sterilized, which I thought was something I hadn't really thought about. But again, because I think what we're hearing is there may be other alternative ways of dealing with this other than the normal biological process, whether it's setting up outposts that have microgravity or other kinds of things, or maybe the fact that you can survive in deep space, but you can't be born there. And then so just any thoughts of that area.
Let me just jump in real quick. I'll let the others take the rest of this, but I just want to say, I think ideally, the vision that many people have for our future in space, I think we want it to be as similar to life on Earth as it can possibly be. I think we want to minimize the number of extreme measures we have to take just to make it possible to go and engage in space exploration, or even to live somewhere beyond Earth. So I think I would argue that our goal should be to try to make it possible to live life the way that we are used to here on Earth. That's why I think, the research that we're talking about that is taking place already and needs to take place in the near future is so essential. But we can't just jump to the end. We can't just jump to, let's just let people, go ahead and have kids and reproduce the way that we naturally do. So I think it's really important to be able to kind of break it down the way that SpaceBorn United is trying to do, into sort of separate phases. Can conception work? Can embryo development work? And only once we've got answers to those first parts of the process should we be thinking about moving on to the end. But ultimately, that should be a goal that we all have.
Okay.
Absolutely. I think also, if you when we first exposed humans to space, we used very strict selection procedures to select the people that have the best tolerance, the best physical, mental conditions. And I think that will happen when we move further into space as well. I mean, the radiation issue becomes bigger. So people differ a lot between each other in terms of radiation resistance by a large factor. So why should we not be safeguarding people and selecting them on those criteria to make it safe, and then lower the criteria, or for very long travel? I mean, I believe it was ESA that is even looking into hibernation options for humans. So, okay, if we're going to use that, okay, some people will have a better tolerance for that. The same for space sickness, there's different tolerances there. So I think selecting people with better propositions, with better genetic dispositions for the hazards that we expose them to would be a good approach to study it safely as a first step. And I love it's fascinating how Christopher Mason that you mentioned, how he's working on gene editing scenarios for the next 500 years. Gene editing to reach other worlds. Great book. But yeah, that's going to be a few decades before we can do gene editing on that scale.
Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. So several questions that are coming in talking about the differences, the buoyancy of the ocean, and could we learn from that? And there are different types of microgravity fields depending upon where you are. And I guess you feel free to comment on that. But I think what we're all kind of saying is, we just don't know. I mean, there are some clues there, but it's obviously because there's so many factors involved that it's very, very difficult. Someone also asked earlier about the possibility of other hospitals or research institutions that want to collaborate on some of these projects. Is there an interest there? You might respond to that.
Very quickly, there's interest from the fertility sector. So we work with hospitals, university hospitals in Europe at the moment. So they obviously have an interest. I recently met a very exciting person. I think she's in the audience, Harvard professor Carmen Messer-Leon, if I pronounce it correctly. They're also preparing experiments for reproductive stages in space. So there's more and more research groups focusing on it. Let's see what Alex and Scott.
Yeah, Alex, you have a.
Yeah, I mean, as far as continuing the research, we've had this, scattered and really scattered across the globe effort that has been ongoing from pockets of researchers, various space agencies, various companies around the world. We really do need to sort of come together in the effort to get all the answers that we need. As far as mammalian reproduction goes, as Scott and Egbert mentioned, there's many steps in this process. We are really on step one. We're still on step one. We've been on step one for the last 50 years. I think that we will need to fill in all the data gaps via a comprehensive experiment that studies multi-generational development. So NASA actually did propose a experiment, I think it was in 2015, called MICEHAB, which stands for a multi-generational independent colony for extraterrestrial habitation, autonomy, and behavioral health. So basically, it is an autonomous robotic space station, mini space station, where you would have generations of rats and mice that are raised by robots, and we're able to study all the effects of not just reproduction, but life in general, how their physiology is impacted, if there is genetic mutation, which I think, knowing the data that we do have right now, there probably would be some effect, but we can see how extreme that is. And we can do that, using creatures that are very, very close to us in their biology, which is, why they're great test subjects. So that should at least give us kind of a solid idea of what the parameters are going to be for primates and human beings going forward in the future. So we at least kind of create a safety, a safe set of ethical parameters for ourselves for experimentation down the line with primates and humans. Okay. And I think that will be the next really big step that we need to take.
Somebody asked an interesting question about cloning technology, that we can clone animals as perhaps one thing to think about. I hadn't thought about that. Any of you have thoughts? Hadn't thought about that one.
I mean, cloning is interesting in that you can create a bunch of genetically identical individuals. So it becomes interesting from a sort of a research design perspective, right? Then you can kind of remove genetic variability from the equation if you're going to do research. So that aspect of it, like scientifically, sounds like it would be, worthwhile. I think in terms of like thinking about how reproduction would take place, if we're talking about human reproduction beyond I don't think it's cloning. I mean, I think we're talking about should be as similar to human reproduction on Earth as possible. But from a research design perspective, cloning could be a component that could factor in.
We've had a lot of discussion about continuing the research and some of the hurdles and the ethical considerations of that. And we talked very briefly about, conception taking place either deliberately or inadvertently in space and what happens. But I'm going to go back to that again, because this one article I read to earlier really was hitting pretty strong on the liability issue with these companies. And we all know that, we talk about ethical standards and policies, but the fact is that we really don't have any way of enforcing those. I mean, we do from a government standpoint, but there are so many private companies, as you probably know. This most recent flight that wasn't successful. There was a lot of controversy about a company putting certain things up there in DNA and other kinds of things by an indigenous tribe that they consider those sacred. That that issue is an issue in and of itself. But what struck me was interesting is when they talked to NASA people and people in the private sector. They basically, the conclusion was, well, this is a private company. We can't tell them what to do. So how do we even approach something like that? How do we even get to a point where we can talk about these policies, but we get to a point where, we can actually develop something that, can we develop something that people pay attention to? And I do want someone, for us to answer not answer, but get to the question of, we could talk about this is, we live in very political times right now, and the idea of somebody inadvertently getting pregnant is not a small issue. Who wants to hit the first one first, just in terms of how do we can talk, say, oh yeah, we need these policies, but how do we actually do that when everybody's on their own?
Well, in terms of space law and policy, that's still something that is very much in development, from everything that I've read. It is an area of high interest, but there's still a lot. I mean, as everything with space, there's still a lot of questions around it. Do the laws of the country that you launched from apply? Do we, perhaps apply law the same way we do with international waters? How far off the surface of the Earth does a country's, law apply? And, what citizens are involved? Something that we have debated in the past, I know Egbert and I have had this conversation, and Scott as well, is when the first baby is born off-world, eventually, what nationality are they?
Right.
So there's a lot of structure that still needs to be built. And I know that debate is ongoing. As far as enforcing any standards, so the FAA currently enforces space flight standards. When it comes to launch, we don't have any really health and safety standards that we're going to be able to lean on for, if there is a liability issue in space with, a pregnant mother and an ectopic pregnancy, and damage happens to the fetus that affects them long term. How is that all going to play out? I mean, this is all completely unexplored territory, as you mentioned. So America being the land of the lawsuit, this is it's going to be interesting to watch everything develop.
Yeah, I just want to say real quick to your point, Alex, and the way you're approaching it. I agree with that, and we're not, I think our conversation is not looking for right or wrong answers or this, but just the fact that these are hard problems, and to everybody's, I think the consensus was it's just I think we're all just saying, yeah, these are hard problems. We don't know the answer, but it's something that we need to be spending time and money on. These are important questions from a whole range of things, scientifically, philosophically, ethically, medically, et cetera. And we just need to be, we don't have answers, but we can't keep kicking this down the road and hoping that we'll figure it out at some point.
Absolutely. These are hard problems, and it's important to look at solutions like space laws, internationally accepted laws. But still, then we know, if you look at history and recent history, not all the countries will apply to it, and
exactly.
There's all these geopolitical forces going on as well. I mean, there's a new space race. There's upcoming space nations. They want to try to achieve unique achievements in space. We've been approached by the United Arab Emirates if they could perhaps adopt our project, because they would very much like to be able to say, hey, the very first human embryo conceived in space, or the very first baby that was conceived in space, is something nice that we want to claim, just to take part in the space race. And we're not, yeah, those forces are also
Right.
to be considered.
Yeah. And with regard to commercial companies and the liability that they might face, every company has their own policies, terms of service, if you will, that if you are a customer going up into orbit for a few days or however long you end up going up there, you're probably going to have to sign a whole bunch of waivers. Passengers already signed a ton of safety waivers. This is just something that's going to have to be added on. But in order to do that legally, we need to be able to be coming from an informed perspective, backed by data, that we can establish informed consent with those passengers, so that they do know the risks of potentials for things like ectopic pregnancy. Whereas it's not going to destroy these companies in court down the line. That's something that these companies need to be aware of, because it is, it's kind of in their blind spot at the moment.
Right. Yeah, that's something obviously would have to be tested in the courts and all that. But that's a really, really good point. Scott, earlier you talked about Earth-like environment, well, making things Earth-like and the evolutionary process for people. Of course, there's also a possibility that when we talk about deep space, that people who spend a time or maybe go through that process, very, very likely, maybe not definitely, but very likely will not be able to live on Earth again. So that's another interesting dilemma that we will have, and maybe we end up with the same problems we have on Earth today, because we'll have people who are on Earth and people who are on Mars, and they're Martians, and their government's different than ours. Who knows? But what do you think the possibility that if we actually do this and perfect it, that there'll be fundamental differences? It probably won't be people going back and forth in terms of living.
Yeah, I mean, this is really at the heart of what I'm working on now with the current book project, and it really I am kind of assuming that one way or another, it's going to be possible for people to not only live their lives elsewhere beyond Earth, but for reproduction one way or another to be possible. So if we assume that is true, yeah, then the question becomes, what becomes of the people living, let's just use Mars as the example, and the people back on Earth. I think, based on what we know about how evolution takes place here on Earth, that anytime you get a group of individuals that are isolated in a different place, like an island, for example, and the environment in that place is different from where they came from, that's actually something we understand pretty well. That is kind of the classic example of how evolution takes place. It's what Darwin figured out when he went to the Galapagos Islands, and all of our research on evolution since then has supported that idea, that is kind of the perfect setup for a new species to evolve. So if it's true that a baby born, say, on Mars wouldn't be able to come back to Earth because their body wouldn't be able to tolerate Earth gravity, for example, or maybe it's even that their immune system wouldn't be able to handle our microbes here on Earth. I think that sets up a scenario where it actually becomes quite likely that people living on Mars split, diverge, become different from people living on Earth, and that it would happen more rapidly than what we typically see for an isolated population on an island here on Earth. So still, we're talking about generations. We're not talking about a few years.
That's a good point.
But over the span of maybe just centuries, that you could actually get sort of a separate type of human living on Mars. So a lot of ifs that are built into that scenario, but if human reproduction is possible out there in space, to me, that is a scenario that logically follows based on what we know about the process of evolution.
Other thoughts there, Alexander?
As far as evolution,
yeah, just what Scott was kind of talking about from your standpoint.
I think so to bring it back to your question earlier, that kind of started everything off. This was pretty eloquently described. I'm guessing there's some folks in the chat who have seen the the sci-fi series The Expanse.
Right.
They kind of, I think, portrayed it pretty well. What we can potentially expect in the future. I sort of fall in the camp of, if you are a human being, you should always be able, regardless of where you were born in the universe, I would hope that you were always able to return to Earth in some fashion. And we don't know if somebody that evolves in Mars gravity is going to be able to do that. Hence, I'm sort of an advocate for the orbital incubator sort of concept, because then you can travel wherever you need to, as long as, well, and hypergravity, which is higher than our own. For example, Jupiter, even though we can't really land on the surface of Jupiter, we'd be crushed. We won't be able to go to larger planets, but we will at least always be able to return to Earth. So I think that is something that is in our DNA. We have always been wanderers. We have always been explorers. So we will always seek to push borders and frontiers, and want to move on to whatever the next system is. But I hope that we would be able to return. So that's kind of my personal philosophy on it.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's really great. So we have just a few minutes left. Somebody asked, is there anything being done using digital twin technology on any of this?
We're interested in it. We've been talking to Washington, Mrs. Washington. Well, we know that it exists and it's really interesting. So we intend to look at it. But yeah, we're being understaffed all the time. So it's on the agenda for us.
Okay. So unfortunately, I've got a couple minutes. Final thoughts.
One thing, Alex, I think we can reveal today. That's a unique thing, Kris.
Yeah.
ASRI and SpaceBorn United and Cranfield University and a few other groups intend to organize an expert symposium.
Oh, great.
By the end of this year, to accelerate and optimize this research for reproduction in space. We're going to reach out to all the relevant experts in the world, basically, to find the synergies and to make it's not a talking head kind of symposium. It's really a collaborative effort with a lot of workshops and interactions to kind of draft the roadmap and get consensus and synergies with organizing the community of research and maybe Alex wants to add something I might have forgotten.
You summarized it pretty well, but kind of as we've discussed, there's been a very small cadre of researchers that have conducted this research in the past that are currently conducting it. That number is growing, but we really just want to optimize the effort, so there's not repetition of work. We're not reproducing each other's efforts just because we're on different sides of the globe, so that we as a species can move forward and meet these challenges in the future.
Yeah, interesting. That's a really interesting point. Scott, do you have any final thoughts here?
I guess my main thing is just to kind of, reiterate that this is such a fascinating time that we're living in because, several folks have referenced the kind of space race that's taking place at the moment. There is already just a tremendous amount of research that's happening, and there's going to be the possibility for so much more. I think, we're highlighting, maybe in some ways more questions than answers here today, but there's going to be answers to those questions really soon. And I think it's a fascinating time to be thinking about these types of things. And I'm glad that you gave us the opportunity, Kris, to kind of explore what are some of the important things that people need to be thinking about? What are the ethical concerns? Because this is happening. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And so I just think it's such a fascinating and exciting time to be exploring these ideas. So yeah, so thanks.
So Egbert, when's the conference you're talking? When you expect that might be?
October, November, right, Alex?
Fall time frame.
Aiming for Houston Space Center.
Okay, we'll make sure we put it on our website too. But I think, people who have an interest in this ought to keep their eye on that, because I think this would be something that's clearly needed. thank you all very much. We're out of time. This has really been interesting. We could have done this for a lot more discussion. I've made tons of notes to myself, and maybe we will follow it up with another, judging from a lot of the questions we got and people saying how much they're enjoying the conversation and are being stimulated by it. Maybe we'll do something to follow up. But again, I want to thank all our panelists, Egbert, Alexander, and Scott. Thank you so much for your time. And thank all of our sponsors as well who have been supporting this. And our next webcast will be in March. Those of you who are interested, but until that time, thank you all for tuning in, and goodbye.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
Our continued exploration of space is accompanied by profound questions, responsibilities, and obligations. What is our place and ultimate responsibility to the larger universe? And how do we maintain a sense of humanity as we leave the planet Earth? These questions and more are discussed in our videos, as well as other curated content at www.humanityindeepspace.com or on YouTube by joining Humanity in Deep Space. The music for this episode was written and performed by Danny Grandstaff and is available at dannygrandstaff.bandcamp.com.